And good evening to everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome each one of you on behalf of the Peninsula Foundation for the first webinar event of the year. And we also wish you all a very happy new year. It's a very interesting topic given the conditions that exist today all over the world. The title is obviously The World Order Turmoil, the Reality of American Empire. And we understand how all of us agree on one aspect that over the last 2.5 years, the current world order is under significant stress due to the war in Ukraine, now the war in Gaza, the US-China conflict, trade, as well as geopolitical conflict and ongoing contest, the rise of new formations that probably many feel would enhance the tensions, for example, in the Indo-Pacific and the AUKUS. And all of this portends what very commonly scholars say is the US as the foremost power since 1945, which is virtually the world's policeman and a hegemon. Is it in decline? Or is the rise of China and along with it India and the re-emergence of Russia is all that contributing to a new power transition struggle for control of the world's economic, technological, political, and security architectures? In a way, the big question is, has the US always been an empire? And I believe so. But I think we need a lot of analysis and understanding, and for which I think our scholars today will contribute immensely. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our chief guest, Mr. Jeremy Kuzmarov from the US, and our own discussant, Mr. Mohan Guruswamy, who's also a distinguished fellow of the Peninsula Foundation. Let me introduce the speakers. Jeremy is the managing editor of Covered magazine, and author of The Russians Are Coming Again with John Marciano. Jeremy is also an author of 4 books on US foreign policy, and he is a social critic. He has taught at numerous universities and colleges in the field of US history and foreign relations. He has taken extensive specialized research on the following topics: covered dimensions of US foreign policy, the war on drugs, US policing and prisons, and the internationalization of US criminal justice, US air power and its human cost, American military-based networks, the false manipulations of the public in selling American wars, among other topics. Jeremy writes in many progressive publications like the Progressive Magazine, Counterpunch, the LA Progressive, the Huffington Post, Z Magazine, ZNet, and has appeared in various media outlets, including on radio and television programs. He's a contributor to Peace website developed by historian Roger Peace that provides comprehensive overviews of major US wars and assesses them from a just war perspective. Kuzmarov has been active in local peace groups and is a board member of the Tulsa Peace Fellowship, a friend of the Asia Pacific Journal, and on the steering committee for Historians for Peace and Democracy. Mr. Mohan Guruswamy is well known to all of us. He is a senior analyst, specializes on geopolitics and social engineering and on politics, political science, and is an alumni of both Harvard and Stanford universities. He's been advisor in the Vajpayee government, and he is a prolific writer and is well known internationally, and his Facebook is extremely popular, keeping people aware on history, political science, and the current goings on in the geopolitical contest. He is a specialist in the China hand. He's a specialist on China as well. Welcome to both of you. Let me invite Jeremy to give his lecture first, which will be for 30 minutes, and his analysis and view on the topic of the day. Jeremy, all yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's a real honor to be with you guys, and I look forward to a great discussion. And yeah, we invite articles for Covert Action Magazine, which aims to educate the broader public and present a critical view on U.S. foreign policy. In September, I attended a talk sponsored by the Tulsa Committee on Foreign Relations by an Inside the Beltway pundit named Ali Wine, a former senior fellow at the Pro-NATO Atlantic Council and David Rockefeller Fellow at the elitist Trilateral Commission. Wine told the audience, and this is the kind of view that's prevalent in the U.S. media as well as academia. He said in not so many words that the sun had not yet set on the American empire, that the Biden administration was outmaneuvering the evil Putin as he's presented in U.S. discourse in Ukraine, and that the U.S. was still a beacon of hope for the rest of humanity. Toward the end, Wine personalized the talk, discussing how his family had migrated to the United States from Pakistan with nothing, and that through hard work he was able to achieve the American dream. But Wine seemed oblivious to the fact that this dream is increasingly unreachable for the majority of people in an increasingly stratified society, marred by a decline in civilian manufacturing and public services and skyrocketing education costs. Wine also failed to point out that the American dream historically was achieved at the expense of third world nations that were looted by U.S. corporations and by endless wars that killed millions of people. Wine's delusional worldview is underscored in a new book by Fadi Lama. I can highly recommend this book called Why the West Can't Win: From Bretton Woods to a Multipolar World, published by Clarity Press in Atlanta, which is also my publisher for two of my books. So if you're not familiar, look up the press. They've got some really great books, and they specialize in books providing critiques of U.S. foreign policy and presenting more international perspective on U.S. foreign relations. And this book, Why the West Can't Win, yeah, refutes what Wine, this inside the Beltway view, Why the West Can't Win shows that the American century is near its end, and that a new multipolar world order has been established or is in the process of being established, in which economic dynamism is shifting east. Lama is an international advisor for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and geopolitical consultant who has a PhD in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech University. He points out at the beginning of his book that in 1500, prior to the era of Western colonialism, there was a relatively fair political economic world order with a close equilibrium between population and wealth generation. But by the end of World War II, the West accounted for only 30% of global population, but 60% of global gross domestic product. When many colonized nations gained their independence, the West imposed a neo-colonial framework that enabled their resources to be exploited by Western multinational corporations. Some countries on the front lines of the Cold War, such as West Germany, Japan, and South Korea, were allowed unhindered development as part of a geopolitical strategy designed to keep them within the Western orbit and curb the advance of communism. However, being pseudo-independent states, when the political necessities was removed, they were cut back to size. The liberation of China in the 1949 communist-led revolution, an event known in the U.S. as the loss of China, was a historical turning point that began to reverse the Western monopolization of wealth and power and set the stage for the re-empowerment of the global South. By 2017, China, which had been known as the sick man of Asia in the 19th century following its de facto colonization by Great Britain following the Opium Wars, was the world's #1 economy, with its real goods production amounting to 24% of global real goods production. And this book has a lot of great statistics. Under CCP leadership, China regained its sovereignty and lifted 770 million people out of poverty, with homelessness now being practically non-existent. According to Lama, China's staggering economic success resulted from a centralized political system in which commercial banking was dominated by the public sector. Central bank financial and monetary policies were further put under the control of the Chinese government, which implemented policies serving the national interest rather than those of the Western financial oligarchy. China's economic success contrasts markedly with the growing economic stagnation in Western countries and the US, resulting from the neoliberal economic model in which the private sector is elevated above the public sector. By 2014, the top 0.1% in the United States owned as many assets as the bottom 90%, an obscene inequality ratio accompanied by a dramatic rise in poverty, which had been reduced massively in China under more socialist-oriented policies. China's superior state-centric economic model is currently being followed to a certain extent by Russia, which has withstood record U.S. sanctions under Putin's leadership through a renewed commitment to economic autarky or self-sufficiency and investment in local industries and technologies. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, U.S. strategic planners saw a golden opportunity to reduce Russia's status to that of a fourth-rate power and to enable the plunder of its bountiful natural resources. The overzealous policies backfired, however, pushing Russia into alliance with China that signifies the birth of a new multipolar world order that holds the potential to restore the global economic parity from 1500 before Western colonization. And, I mean, the world was not perfect in 1500, but as far as, equality levels and parity, it was much better than what we see after the evils of Western colonization took root. Lama emphasized the fact that Russia now provides food aid in Afghanistan and Africa and fertilizer to poor countries, and has forged growing relations not just with China, but also Iran, the latter having gained independence from Western colonial tutelage in 1979 when the Shah was overthrown. Lama finds significant economic synergy and growing win-win cooperation in the economic, cultural, scientific, and military field between China, Russia, and Iran, which he says are de facto allies in the struggle for a fair world. Russia and China today are leading the way in space exploration, clean energy technologies, as well as cutting-edge missile technologies, at a time when U.S. weapon systems are proving to be extraordinarily costly and inefficient, owing to a Byzantine Pentagon contracting system and underskilled workforce due to skyrocketing costs of higher education. Today's shifting power balance can be compared with 1997, when the U.S. empire, had control over 3 of the top 4 energy reserves. Venezuela was the U.S. vassal. Russian energy resources were under the control of the Western financial oligarchs via their proxy Russian oligarchs, and Saudi Arabia was a compliant U.S. tributary. Of the top 4, only Iranian reserves were out of the Western financial oligarchy's control. By 2022, Lama writes, the empire had lost control of the top 3 reserves, Venezuela, Iran, and Russia, while Saudi Arabia is no longer as compliant as it was in 1997. What happened in the interim was a period of heightened military intervention and imperial overreach, resulting in a counter-mobilization that signified the end of Western empires dating back to the 16th century. The imperial framework after World War II was established through the Bretton Woods economic system, which Lama says was designed to lock countries into a financial structure controlled by the West. He writes that this structure requires central bank governors be independent of their governments, but dependent on rules established by the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, at the top of the pyramid of the Bretton Woods system. Established in 1930 to handle reparations payments imposed on Germany at the Versailles Conference after World War I, the BIS had helped finance Hitler's rise to power and was owned by central banks, setting policies for them directly that influenced the global economy. Franklin Roosevelt had proposed liquidating the BIS due to its cooperation with Nazi Germany, though the resolution that he sponsored to that effect at the July 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, at which the post-World War II monetary and political global structure was being set, was revoked after Roosevelt's death. According to Lama, when some newly decolonized countries tried to adopt an alternative economic arrangement to Bretton Woods, their leaders like Sylvanus Olympio of Togo, Nasser of Egypt, Sukarno of Indonesia, Lumumba of Congo, Mossadegh of Iran, and Roldos of Ecuador, and Panama's Torrijos These leaders were eliminated by wars, coups, or assassinations, often involving the CIA. Economic hitmen would descend on developing countries, offering loans for infrastructure projects whose real purpose was to plunge these countries into debt so they would become dependent on foreign creditors and their economies could be restructured along neoliberal lines and in the service of multinational corporations. A pillar of the Bretton Woods system was that the US dollar was established as the international trade currency, which was convertible into gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce of gold. With the decline of US competitiveness in the 60s, the Nixon administration froze the convertibility of the US dollar in gold and instead made it convertible to oil, provided that oil was sold only in US dollars. This led to a dramatic increase in the price of oil and petrodollar arrangements with Saudi Arabia, by which the US provided military protection and weapons to the Saudis in exchange for the promise of them trading their oil in US dollars and using income from oil to buy US Treasury bills. Interest on these sales was then spent by the US Department of the Treasury on infrastructure projects in Saudi Arabia to be executed by US companies. The fact that other countries had to hold reserves in US dollars to cover their oil imports allowed the US to incur high trade deficits bred by deindustrialization in the neoliberal era without causing a depreciation of the US dollar. However, this arrangement we're seeing that it's beginning to come apart, and Russia and China are spearheading a shift in the global economy by which oil and other commodities are no longer being traded in US dollar. This is starting, ushering the end of the American century. The Lama book includes discussion of the growth of the Western financial oligarchy, what he calls the money power, who are the major shareholders of the leading hedge fund like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, and become the absolute rulers over society. And this money power is well placed to control elections in Western democracies and control mass media in all its forms, print, TV, and social media platforms. They support free trade agreements designed to usurp what little is left of national sovereignty and a neoliberal vulture economy in which all aspects of the economy are privatized in order to maximize corporate profits. And this is, I think, one goal in countries like Ukraine that they're pursuing. And they appointed Penny Pritzker, who's head of a corrupt banking dynasty, to head the reconstruction efforts in Ukraine to open it up to this process and to these vultures. The U.S. decline has been fueled by the money power's recognition that maintaining a strong manufacturing base was no longer necessary when trade deficits could be offset by currency manipulation owing to Nixon's convertibility of the US dollar to oil and the trade in oil around the world in US dollars. The US economy, and of course, the money power fuels all these wars, and they own the major defense contractors that profit massively from the endless wars. The US economy is totally dominated by these interests, and they flourish at the expense of other vital economic sectors. And this is why the West is stagnating, because you have such extreme wealth concentration and a lack of investment in manufacturing and overall dynamism, as well as huge cuts in government services, is leading to growing, third world conditions for a lot of the population. The intense Russophobia cultivated in the U.S. media over the last decade is the result of the money power's lust for Russia's immense wealth, which it was starting to gain access to in the 90s, before Vladimir Putin reasserted national control over Russia's economy. The anti-Russia propaganda has had the greatest impact on the educated classes, as 77% of Americans with postgraduate degrees now consider Russia as an enemy, this in a March 2022 poll, compared to 66% with high school education or less. The propaganda, controlled by the money power, the media, and increasingly educational institutions, it targets the educated classes who have mobilized in the new Cold War because of this Russophobia. And Russophobia has been combined with an ascendant Islamophobia and Sinophobia, whose purpose is to mobilize public support for confronting the troika of powers, Russia, Iran, and China, which threaten Western hegemony, and particularly their alliance. So they would obviously want to, I think, U.S. foreign policy strategies to try and fracture that alliance. According to Lama, if a date were to be identified for the end of the U.S. empire, it would be January 8, 2020, when Iran avenged the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani by attacking a U.S. airbase in Iraq and displaying Iran's weapons capability. Afterward, the U.S. Central Command significantly relocated its headquarters from Doha, Qatar, 120 miles from Iranian shores, to safety in Tampa, Florida. While the current U.S. war in Gaza has created a renewed pretext, or Israeli war, but U.S. is heavily involved, it's created a renewed pretext for expanded U.S. military intervention in the Middle East. However, it's unlikely the U.S. could win a war in the Middle East or influence regime change in Iran, which has long been the goal of the neoconservatives. This is really a pipe dream. Contrary to this think tank analyst I mentioned at the beginning, Ali Wine, the U.S. has really been outmaneuvered in Ukraine, whose army is in a state of disrepair after a failed counteroffensive. And there are reports in our media even about how Ukraine is press ganging. They're kidnapping people in Kiev to send them to the front line. The Ukrainians no longer want to fight. They see that it's a suicide mission, and the morale is way down. And that's even being reported in American media. The U.S. has been being outmaneuvered by China, which is winning the hearts and minds through the Belt and Road Initiative that provides low-interest loans to countries for infrastructural development with no strings attached, unlike the World Bank and IMF, where they restructure their whole economy to suit Western corporations' interests. In sum, we see the great game is being lost, as this book really points out, by the United States and by the money power that dominates there. And this is why we are in a dangerous period of history. They're behaving so erratically because they know they're losing, and they're manufacturing crisis after crisis. And they're also losing control over their own population. There's growing rebellions in Western countries. There are huge strikes and protests in Europe, as well as the United States. And we've seen this over the Gaza war. There have been huge numbers coming out in American cities, tens of thousands, and worldwide, to protest that horrible war. And this is, I think, why the elites and money power is behaving so erratically, creating manufacturing crisis after crisis as they desperately attempt to sustain a fading world order defined by profound inequality and injustices. So I can try with the remaining time. I don't know how much time I have left. I can try and address the questions that were sent to me yesterday. So I think the first question was, how will it shape the future world order with U.S. war making and the growing pushback with the rise of BRICS? And well, I said, that there is a threat of a world war breaking out, as the U.S. cannot tolerate geopolitical competitors and its relegation to a second-rate power or a growing multipolar world order, and it may respond violently, and this is what we see so far. Currently, the U.S. is provoking war simultaneously with Russia, China, and in the Middle East. John Pilger had warned, a great Australian journalist, had warned back in 2016. He made a film that's very good about the coming war with China, and this is very real, a danger. And it is instructive to look back to history. I think there's some parallels with the 30s, although then the U.S. was an ascendant empire. Now it's a declining one. But in the 30s, when the U.S. faced a challenge to its empire and to Western empire with Japan, when Japan established the greater economic prosperity sphere, this was a challenge to Western hegemony in Southeast Asia, and a threat to supplant the Western colonial powers there. And records from the time reveal how the U.S. Maneuvered Japan. Their strategy was basically to destroy the Japanese co-prosperity sphere and to provoke a war with Japan so they can destroy it and establish U.S. hegemony in the Asia Pacific. And the goal, though, was to maneuver, and this was a quote from Henry Stimson, was the Secretary of State, under Franklin Roosevelt. He said, we have to maneuver it so Japan fires the first shot, so it doesn't look like we're the aggressor. And the FDR administration had imposed a crippling oil embargo on the Japanese, which cut off their oil supply, and that backed them into a corner and resulted in the Pearl Harbor attacks. And there's evidence that FDR knew about these attacks, but allowed them to go forward because the American public would only support military intervention if America were attacked. But the attack had to be made to look like it was a sneak attack by a dastardly enemy, even though Japan had been provoked through the oil embargo and other maneuvers by the United States, and the U.S. had rejected diplomatic overtures. Um, History could easily repeat itself today. We could be in a new Pacific War in the next 5 or 10 years. The U.S. military is, in fact, preparing for war in the Asia Pacific, building a new military base in Micronesia in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and training soldiers in jungle warfare in Hawaii. There was a big article in the New York Times a few weeks ago about this jungle warfare training that U.S. troops are undergoing in Hawaii, and how they're studying battles from the Pacific War, like the Battle of Guadalcanal, which they anticipate fighting potentially again now with China. And a General Charles A. Flynn, commander of U.S. Army Pacific, is quoted in this piece stating that China had been, quote, an incremental, insidious, and on an irresponsible path for decades. So this is the view of the U.S. military. Lama and other, I think, sensible people recognize how China has overcome its legacy of neocolonialism and expanded, its economy and helped people get out of poverty. But from the U.S. military's point of view, this is somehow an irresponsible path. And he said, now more than ever, the total army needs to prioritize relevant Pacific experience. So they're studying the Pacific War to fight, prepare in preparation for fight against China, because they can't tolerate any rival to their power or a country superseding the U.S. economically. So that's the danger we have today. Um, the second question dealt with contest of empires. With the while the European empires were destroyed, the gain was for the U.S. has emerged as the most powerful actor after World War II, and that's certainly true. And the defeat of the Japanese Empire, was very crucial to establishing U.S. Hegemony in the Asia Pacific and the chain of military bases that the U.S. still possesses, including in Okinawa, Japan, and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, South Korea, Philippines, other places. Did the U.S. foresee this plan and its rise to a position as a preeminent power, ensuring the destruction of the European powers? Yes, absolutely. This was definitely planned. In fact, there's a book called, I can recommend, written in 1960 by Richard von Alstein, historian, called The Rising American Empire. And actually, he showed that from the beginning of the country, he analyzes the rhetoric of the American founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, and he find that they all had imperial ambitions. They all spoke about the British and Roman empires, and they wanted the United States to be the greatest empire of all, greater than those empires. And he also goes into the pacification of the Native Americans. The first step was the pacification of the Native Americans, and that was, once that was achieved, they can move outward into the world. And after World War II was the great opportunity to supplant the European empires. And one book I was recently reading a book to do a review on the Congo, and it showed how there were certain financial interests, who in mining, and their goal was to replace the Belgians. So they were involved in the assassination of Lumumba. With the CIA was supporting that because he was trying to nationalize the mines and other resources. And then when they brought in Joseph Mobutu, they supported him. There was a Katanga secession. And that was supported mostly by Belgium because Belgium owned a lot of the mines in the diamond-rich Katanga province. But these American mining tycoon, like this guy named Maurice Tempelsman and Harold Hochschild were the owners of the mines. They supported Mobutu to crush the Katanga secession, so they could basically reduce the Belgian influence, consolidate. Mobutu was like the American proxy, and then they could gain control over the mines from the Belgians in Katanga. So that's kind of emblematic of how in the post-World War II order, the U.S. was trying to take over, and U.S. corporations take over the wealth and economic control from Europeans in Africa and elsewhere. The next question was about the U.S.-led post-45 world order rests on its control of three pillars: political, economic, and security. The question is Western Europe an ally of the U.S. or is it an unequal relationship? Well, I would say, yeah, it is an ally, but to a point. Yeah, like we see, there's a lot of rivalry, like in Africa, between European countries and the United States. Like in the Rwanda and Congo case I've studied and followed, the U.S. and UK were supporting like the Rwandan Patriotic Front and Paul Kagame, the current president of Rwanda, when France had been supporting the Hutu, the previous leader, Habyarimana. And there was a kind of rivalry playing out there between the U.S. with the UK against France. So we see that. I think we also see, though, that today a lot of Europeans are starting to question their alliance with the U.S., especially because of the conflict in Ukraine and and the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline had a real adverse effect on European economies and their ability to access, Russian natural gas cheaply. And it forced, like in Germany, it forced the Germans to buy, or other European countries, to buy from the Middle East or to buy from American natural gas producers. But the cost was much, much higher. So it had a real adverse effect on their economy and caused a lot of hardship for people who couldn't afford their energy bills anymore. And so I think the population were starting to turn on their governments. There were a lot of protests in Germany over the Ukraine conflict. Uh, so I think a lot of Europeans are really starting to question that their governments are too loyal to the United States and have sacrificed their own economic sovereignty. And a lot of countries in Europe, benefit from trade relations with Russia. And when these have been cut off, it's adversely affected their economy. So they're seeing really a negative in allying with the United States. And I think we'll see Europe trying to assert more independence and autonomy from the U.S. in the coming years, and probably will tire of Ukraine. I mean, it's surprising that they've continued to fund the Ukraine war all this time when it's not in their national interest at all. The next question dealt with decolonization. The U.S. was an expanding empire since the American-Spanish War. The Cold War was a check on the American expansion. Well, yeah, I would say, yeah, absolutely. The U.S. From the beginning of the country, and this study by von Alstein again makes clear that the U.S. was an expansionist empire, and that was the ambition of the founding fathers of the country. I think the Cold War actually was used as a pretext to ramp up. And this, in my book, The Russians Are Coming Again, I go into detail about this. And this is why I warned, and I called for a movement against the new Cold War, an alliance of conservatives and liberals to resist a new Cold War. And I go into the history and the disastrous consequences of the first Cold War, where the U.S. could use the excuse of fighting communism as an excuse to go into countries everywhere and for these financial oligarchs to really plunder the economy and to support the most right-wing factions under the excuse that they're anti-communist. So and the U.S. really used the Cold War as a pretext to expand its power and to fight wars like Vietnam. So I think the Cold War was disastrous for humanity, and I think it's terrible that we're embarking on a new Cold War now. The next question, there are a couple left, was at the end of the Cold War, an American unipolar dominance unleashed the push for the American empire through global war on terror and a series of other wars. Absolutely, yeah. I think the global war on terror will see the U.S., all the worst features of the U.S. empire have come out in this war on terror. I mean, the bombing of civilian, the lack of regard for the humanity of the people in affected countries, the looting of those countries' economy, like in Iraq, by U.S. corporations, the torture, just the real ugly side with the Abu Ghraib was emblematic of the torture in Guantanamo Bay, embodied just the worst aspects of U.S. history and U.S. empire have come out and I guess shown its true colors for the rest of the world. If people were under the illusion, because I mean, America and empire was sustained, with propaganda. Hollywood was very effective propaganda, and there's this kind of image, great image America is often able to project through Hollywood film, and this allure of America that captures people worldwide. They all want to come to America and go to Disneyland. But the ugly side really came out in the global war on terror with the torture and the violence underlying the American century. So, as far as the next question dealt with NATO expansion, conflict with Russia and anti-China strategy, a clear case of imperial overstretch and suicidal. I think so, yes. Back in the 90s, George Kennan, who was the father of the containment strategy in the original Cold War, warned about NATO expansion, stating that NATO expansion would amount to quote him, strategic blunder of epic proportions and the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era, as it would inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and impel Russian foreign policy in a direction decidedly not to our liking. And Kennan's prediction proved to be true and has led us to where we are today, this new Cold War, with the U.S. having torn up arms control treaties of the 90s, having initiated a proxy war with Russia that could lead to a full-blown war between the two countries and even nuclear conflict. Already, yeah, I mean, this would obviously be suicidal if there's an actual nuclear war broke out. Already, this new Cold War is again diverting badly needed U.S. resources towards the military and a senseless new arms race, much like in the original Cold War, which produced heavy deficits and third world type living conditions in the United States with astronomical inequality, underfunded education and healthcare, abysmally poor public services, including areas like mental health. So that's a huge, consequence for Americans as the government is investing massively again in military buildup and out of control arms race, and it's not investing in its community, in the communities in the United States in education and healthcare. And as far as China, yeah, this is really insane. I mean, the U.S. depends on China purchasing U.S. debt. The U.S. economy is dependent on China, and China also has superior military technology capabilities that would give it an edge in any war with the United States. Um, and yeah, Charles Freeman is a retired diplomat who served as Nixon's translator when he famously visited China in the 1970s to reestablish U.S. diplomatic relations with China. And I interviewed Freeman, and he said that, yeah, of course, China was not a military threat to the United States. It was only seen as a threat because of its growing economy. But the U.S. should not see this as a threat. It actually created an opportunity. China's economic growth created an opportunity for the U.S. to kind of harness that growth to its own advantage. And there was, great opportunities for more cooperation. And Friedman is a proponent of the U.S., supporting a cooperative strategy and foreign policy with China. And he's among those to lament this course taken. It's really since the Obama administration disastrously instituted the pivot to Asia policy, which was a policy of military confrontation, which totally eviscerated Nixon. Nixon had developed a more progressive strategy toward China, even though Nixon was not a progressive leader and did some terrible things in office, but he had, I think, the right approach toward China. And Freeman served in that administration in engaging with China. But Obama, with his pivot to Asia, started this course of military confrontation and encirclement and it's been expanded by Trump and Biden, and also an economic war. What we're seeing is reminiscent of what was done to Japan in the 30s that led to the Pacific War, with an economic war being instituted on China, as well as a military buildup surrounding it. And that was similar. FDR had enacted a huge naval buildup prior to the Pacific War encircling Japan. So, the real danger of the Pacific War, a new Pacific War. And yeah, I guess I'm running out of time, but just to quickly answer the last few questions, our current wars in Ukraine and Gaza sign of major turbulence. Absolutely, yeah. And sadly, I mean, these wars were easily avoidable. I mean, in the Ukraine case, if the U.S. had left Ukraine alone, they had a pro-Russian government that was popularly elected under Viktor Yanukovych, and there were elections scheduled for, I believe, 2015 or later in 2014, but they stay, this Maidan protest movement was kind of engineered in part in the United States through agencies like the National Endowment for Democracy, and they tapped into certain elements in Ukraine, including far right-wing elements and Banderites who worship the Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera, and these forces were mobilized to overthrow the Yanukovych government illegally in a blatant coup. And yeah, I interviewed people who were in the Maidan protests, and they said, well, we didn't have enough votes for impeachment, so they used violent methods, and that there was an election coming up. And if he was unpopular, Yanukovych, they could have waited for the election and had a vote, and somebody else would have been elected. Instead, they overthrew him violently, and they plunged the country into war when they attacked the eastern provinces. And you had the Minsk peace framework that could have been abided by to avert this conflict. But Angela Merkel admitted that this was that they didn't take it seriously. They said, "Oh, we just signed that to bide our time to build up Ukraine military capability." So they wanted a confrontation with Russia, and it's really a totally avoidable catastrophe, and it's caused senseless loss of life on a massive scale, and including for Ukrainians, an entire generation of youth has been decimated. And as I mentioned at the beginning, they're now press ganging people into service because Ukrainians don't want to engage in suicide missions. So I guess I'll have to end there unless there would be a few more points I had. But
We can take
yeah,
it
I
up
mean,
from
I
the
think,
questions.
yeah, exactly. To underscore that, I think we are entering a shift in world history, and that the Western decline is real, and the world power centers are shifting, and that is the one good of all this. The bad is that if the U.S. Cannot accept this, they're going to start a world war, and they won't go down without apocalyptic violence, and that's a real danger.
Thank you, Jeremy. That's very comprehensive, excellent coverage. 2 points emerge very strongly. The US has been an empire, as you pointed out, from the founding father days. They've always looked at establishing a powerful empire. And that is the cause, as one of the writers brought out a book called The United States of War, rather than the United States of America. That's one. Second is, as Michael Hudson brought out, the US is essentially in control of the corporate oligarchs, whether it's the military industrial complex, the oil industry, the big tech, and the financial sector. And it's capitalism probably, the question is capitalism the driver for continuing wars? Throughout its history, except for all of 20 years, the US has been at war most of the time. So let me invite Mohan to give his comments. And post 1945, the three pillars were established to ensure the empire's control. So you demolished the European empires, you actually brought in an American empire. So it's neo-colonialism, colonialism by another name, and rest of the world suffers for it. Is that true? And how is that? How do you look at it? Mohan, all yours. Yeah. You'll have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you, Mathis. Jeremy, that was interesting. You spoke like people this part of the world should be speaking, and you should have been, normal circumstances, been the moderator, trying to moderate our views and calm us down. But you've done the job for us. So I'm not going to comment very much on what you said. I largely agree, but I don't, the change you're talking about of the end of empire is happening. Empires don't end suddenly. Even the Greeks and the Romans, they all lingered on for long. Even the Mughals in India, after Aurangzeb, there were 7 more Mughals, and it only ended in 1857. So empires go on for long. And so we're not going to see the end of the American power or primacy in the world day after tomorrow, but it's going to happen. So that is the inevitable course. Already, the BRICS countries have gone past the G7 in GDP, collective GDP, PPP terms. The BRICS countries now amount to 32%, and G7 is 30%. So this order is changing. 20 years ago, in 1999, 25 years ago, the US reserves, currency, accounted for 72% of world reserves. Today it is 59%. It's coming down. The amount of money which, the amount of dollars which is driving the world economy is actually coming down in percentage terms. And this is an interesting system we've got now, economic system. You spoke about US trade deficits. But without US trade deficits, we will all be dead. The US is one country with whom India has a trade surplus. China has a trade surplus. Every country in the world has a merchandise trade surplus with the US. I think there are only 4 countries which have deficits. And so without the US deficit and the US Fed with its 5 printing presses printing dollars and generating dollars, the world economy will immediately get into a recession, a tight recession. If the US were to balance its trade, we'll all be dead. So I think this unbalancing, this unbalanced state of the world will take time to end. It'll take some years, some decades before it starts leveling down to a more sensible pattern. Right now, what's happening is like, the US prints the notes, we make the goods, and we run to the US with goods and software or whatever, and take the notes from the US and put it back in the American banks. And the Americans then lend it to their own citizens, who then buy Chinese and Indian and ASEAN goods. And we get money and oil, and we take it back to American banks. So this is a circular thing going on. And it seems to work well for the capitalists sitting in Wall Street, because they are handling all this money. And if you notice, the people who make money in the world, real money in the world, are not the industrialists anymore. They are people who shift and shovel money around. These are the guys who make the big bucks. The industrialists, even our own industrialists who are supposed to be rich, are rich only in valuation terms. But in terms of hard cash, it's the fellows in Wall Street who got the cash, who move the cash. So I don't, so the system we cannot afford to end the system. Suddenly, if you start balancing your books, then we will all be without jobs in India. Our export industry will collapse, our software industry will collapse, China's manufacturing will collapse. So, we'll all be in trouble. So we are invested in this dysfunctionality of the US system. Now, you spoke about the plan for an empire. This moment came in Bretton Woods when the US delegate Harry Dexter White rejected Lord Keynes' proposal for an international currency to manage our trade. He proposed Bancor. That is, when we export, we will get Bancors, and when we buy, we'll pay you in Bancor. But America said, no, we don't want this. We only want trade to be done in dollars. And it's very interesting because now it's been discovered. Why did Harry Dexter White do it? was never really understood because it seemed to be a perfectly sensible solution to imbalances in world trade. But he insisted and was insistent on it. And even Treasury Department of the US was not quite clear why he was doing it. But now it has been discovered in the last few years that Dexter actually was the communist agent, was the Soviet agent. And was he acting on Stalin's instructions? We don't know. But he certainly created a system which imbalanced the world. Maybe Stalin's calculation was if you had an imbalanced situation, it will lead to a world revolution and unhappiness in the world. And it will kind of destabilize the world order. However, it didn't happen. It actually consolidated the Americans into the kind of huge power it is. The reality today is that the US may not be the #1 economy in the world for very long. And in PPP terms, China has already crossed it. In PPP terms, India will be crossing it in the next 20 years or so. By 2045, we're a completely different world. But the US will be the driver of the world economy because innovations and changes in technology are taking place in America and the West Coast. And that is driving the world changes, whether it's in IT, artificial intelligence, or biotech, or whatever is happening in the universities in America. And that is the source of America's strength today, a superb educational system. The world is we send our best to America to study, or second best at least to study, because the first best have to qualify through a very tight, rigorous system. So the guys who don't make it to the IITs or IIMs or law schools or whatever go to America. So, but whatever it is, these are the people. 70% of the new patents in IT, artificial intelligence, biotech are now by Indians and Chinese scientists working in America. So this change is taking place. But I think one change which we all seem to miss is the demographic change in America. America is changing from a predominantly white country to a mixed country. Last year, for the first time, the number of colored children born exceeded the number of white children. In another 20 years, the imbalances will be the complexion of American population, also with migration, illegal and legal migration, will completely change. What you're seeing today in America is a fight back from entrenched white, interests, particularly in the Midwest, the redneck area, which is the Trump country, the red country on your TV maps, including Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is half Cree. And so, this is a fight back which is happening. And how America will change, we don't know. If America changes, we already see, Obama came to power. We saw a slight shift in changes in policy towards Africa. There was an African command which came up, more spending in Africa. George Bush, who followed Obama, spent more money in African assistance and invested in AIDS research, which the others were not willing to do because they thought of AIDS as mostly an African disease. So all these changes are taking place. Whether this will change the character of America, we don't know. Suppose we have lots of Indians and blacks now entering, Africans and Europeans coming into American politics. Kamala Harris may be just a breath away from Biden's presidency if Biden gets reelected. How she would behave in the White House is going to be interesting to watch. And as the US power structure keeps changing and it becomes less ivory white, and ivory towers also become less white, then America itself might change. But what you said about Ukraine and Russia, you're absolutely bang on. What Russia is occupying in Ukraine, in the Ukraine as it is now, is Russian territory, ethnic Russian territory. That's where, the Russian population is. And, the US, by its Orange Revolution, destabilized that system. Russia was perfectly happy with Yanukovych, and it will continue. We had the revolution there, Maidan Revolution, drove the poor chap out, and the result ceased power and started waging a civil war from 2014. What does Putin do? This is what we did in Bangladesh. So we understand this, that when your own interests are affected by something happening in your neighbors, then you will step in. And the US pushed it, and this war has come as a godsend to American industry and the economy, because if you're going to pump in $800 billion, Mitch McConnell said it rightly. He said, this money is not going to Ukraine, this money is coming to us. So this money will go to Raytheon and to all the bomb makers and all the artillery fellows and the tanks, and and it will also allow you to experiment in ammunition. Big supply. As longer the war goes on, the more rockets they will use, the more drones they will use, the more ammunition they'll expend. So this actually serves America. War is good for America. War is America's great business. From its great growth periods, whenever there was a good war going on, whether it was the Korean War, the Vietnam War, World War II, America keeps growing. America needs, the economy is structured in this manner, the military-industrial complex being what it is. Eisenhower said rightly that, this is a danger, but it's a danger which nobody is able to control. This danger will be controlled, can be controlled, only when the predominance of the US in global economy keeps reducing. And that reduction is taking place. That's an inevitable natural process. New powers will emerge, new countries will emerge. And I only hope that the new countries which emerge, don't emulate what the US did and create another international order like the one we have now. Totally unequal, unbalanced, based on war. Whether we will create a new world based on good values, better values is what we should be concerned about now. Atish?
Yeah, thank you, Mohan. That's wonderful. So the floor is open to the audience. Please raise your questions, raise your hand, and you can intervene. In the meantime, let me ask a couple of questions using the privilege of chair. Jeremy, you made a point, very, very important point, that from the foundation, from the founding fathers' days, the US has been an expansionist empire. And that's true. The certain colonies, the moment they declared their independence, the next they were looking at is removing the English imposed rule of not venturing out beyond the agreed borders between the natives and the colonists. And they just went westward, expanding at a tremendous pace over the next 50 years. 1853, Commodore Perry came to Japan to actually threaten Japan to open up, or else, the 4 ships sailed in there. So you have, or the American-Spanish War, you went out to save Philippines and then colonize Philippines for the next nearly 50 years, right? So the US has been an empire, and the military, as you made a very important point about imperial overstretch, which Paul Kennedy brings out beautifully in his book written almost 30 years ago. So the US is very clearly in a state of imperial overstretch. And that happens when military then becomes overpowering instrument to sustain or project their empire. So the military spends, the American security spends close to 1.3 to 1.5 trillion a year. 900 billions on the military and the remaining on homeland security and other apparatus. And that's unsustainable. And so the decline, whatever, its strengths may be as a democracy, etc., the decline is going to be huge when you're not able to sustain. So is that, clear? Don't the political leadership see that, or are they still prisoners to the oligarchs, the military-industrial complex, and they continue their way? Is it an irreversible trend that's going on?
Well, yeah, I agree. That's a good analysis. Very good question. Yeah, it's, I guess, hard to answer. Yeah, I guess, we can all see that this is really cancerous. I mean, I think a lot of the public increasingly do see that. But I think there is a disconnect with the political elite, and I think a lot of it has to do with the way elections are structured, that to survive politically, they need to they need to raise money from these military contractors, from the Wall Street interests that fund or own or partial owner of these military industry. And that's what Eisenhower warned about with the military industrial complex. And Ray McGovern is a CIA analyst, and he used the concept of Mickey Mat, military, industrial, congressional. I forget what they all stand for. Academia, think tank complex, and they seem to have just taken over all the institutions. And I mean, a lot of Americans don't trust the media anymore because they know it's just war propaganda. But it continues, yeah, as Mohan said, the system, even though these empires have lost their legitimacy, or this mode of governing may have lost the legitimacy, it kind of drags on year after year. And I mean, there are a lot of, there's a good book called The $1 Trillion Silencer I did a review on by a woman, and it was an analysis of the military industrial complex and its kind of staying power, even though, as you say, this is very unhealthy and unsustainable. I mean, it's unhealthy because they're not investing in manufacturing and civilian manufacturing. The U.S. has lost its edge there. But she emphasizes that, they strategically place military bases all over the United States, and often in rural areas, so it sustains the economy for an entire region, and that kind of draws people in, that they're reliant on jobs for these companies, the arm manufacturer, and then the politicians. That's where they get their money. So it somehow has a huge staying power, even though it's so unhealthy. It's horrible for the world because it means these wars are all, there's always a new war somewhere else that they're fighting. And it's also horrible for Americans, for the American economy. And I mean, it's corrupted I mean, this is what Martin Luther King said years ago. It's just corrupted the moral and spiritual fabric of the country. King said in his famous speech against the Vietnam War, a nation that spends so much on the military and not on programs of human uplift is approaching spiritual death. And I mean, we've seen that, with the to me, that these endemic mass shootings in the United States is a manifestation of that spiritual sickness and moral decay bred by this permanent warfare apparatus. But yeah, I think I agree with most of Mohan's point that somehow it has a staying power. I guess like other empires of the past, which were decadent, but they lingered on for some time. So.
Yeah. So, Mohan, like you said, the education system is one of the strong points of the American, nation. Well, science, technology, and the new digital tech is extremely fine. There's nothing much you can actually uh, interfere with. But humanities and social sciences, like Jeremy said, nobody trusts the media anymore. The Western control media anymore. Even the academia seems to be coming under doubt in terms of the quality or the adherence to rigorousness of neutral research. How would you comment on that?
Yeah, I would agree. I think, especially, yeah, I agree with Mohan's point that the top universities are still very dynamic when it comes to science, technology. I mean, I think there's still a good humanities programs, and things like literature, but the humanities has really been decimated over the last generation. It's been defunded, devalued. A lot of students are going more for business major. If they're not going in for science, they're going in for business. Whereas in the past, they would go for a degree in humanities and whatever career they would pursue. In a lot of job, they'll train you on the job, so you don't necessarily need a business degree to work in business. And a humanities degree can give you good skills like writing skills and critical thinking and communication. just broaden your horizon. But they've really devalued that, and I think that goes with the decline of democracy. And also, I've been in the field of foreign relations, and American history have become very politicized. And they're kind of, I mean, you had the McCarthy era where academics who had left-leaning views were purged, and that's kind of come back in big time. And people have lost their jobs. I've even been pushed out of myself because I had critical views of like the U.S. foreign policy, and criticizing the U.S. as an empire, and criticizing U.S. policy toward Russia. They kind of, you're not going to advance in your career, and they could even remove you from teaching positions for adopting critical perspective. So, yeah, it's increasingly like the media, where they're just pushing certain narratives, and iconoclasts are being phased out. So it's an ominous trend. Yeah, it goes with the decline of democracy. I mean, I think the U.S. was once put up as this, or many saw it as this model democracy, but that's increasingly slipping. And I think there was more freedom a generation or two ago in higher education, as well as in the media. There was more, certain like there was. Critical journalists like Seymour Hersh, you probably know about. Like, he used to write for the New York Times. I mean, he's a really good investigative reporter who exposed a lot of corruption, and he broke the stories of like the My Lai massacre and the Abu Ghraib. And he used to write for the most prominent newspaper like New York Times and New Yorker magazine, but they basically purged him, and he can, now only publishes in European publications, or he self-publishes on the internet. So that's just an example of how these kind of critical voices have been basically purged, and younger people are intimidated, like my generation. If they adopt a critical position, they're not going to get appointments to good universities, and they could even be fired. So I think it's a bad situation. There's a receding democracy going hand in hand with more, kind of imperialism on steroids, is what I was saying, like in the global war on terror. So it's a very bad environment right now, toxic environment.
Mohan, would you comment on this?
Right. It's also tied up with funding. The big funders today of research in humanities, forget about science, humanities are the big corporations, in the big banks. And they also have endowed chairs. Now, you can't want to go and research the effects of global capitalism on jobs in the third world. If you propose a study, nobody will fund it. But if you speak about the beneficial effects of that, and find something, you'll always find something. And then, you can get funding for it. So the funders decide the work you do, and that is having an effect on. But, the decline in quality, decline of government funds for research, for pure research, as you're seeing in India also, will have its effects, consequences downstream, further down the line. And you're seeing this happen in all these countries, not only like in Britain now. The quality of British education is really gone down. The quality of not teaching, but the quality of research has gone down. The amount of new books, the kind of new books which come out, has also gone down. So, after all, if people are going to give money, like the tobacco companies were able to hold off the effect of studies on the effect of tobacco on cancer for a long time, including you had studies which said that margarine was good. There are studies which say that Coca-Cola is good. But if you take funds from them, even the Harvard Public Health School has published a study saying that, that sugar is not all that bad. So, this is bound to happen. But this is how we are structured. Unless we are talking about a totally new structure, which didn't happen even in China or in Russia. when they had their revolutions, they said we're going to create a brave new world. The result is what you saw was consolidation of power in small cabal, small numbers of people, even within the Communist Party. There was no discussion, debate. Some people feel power.
Vishnu Reddy.
This constant struggle for democracy, as Jeremy says, is going to be a constant study. Sorry. Going to be constant.
Yeah. Yeah, and particularly important for, with India sending so many students.
I'm on a discussion call back later.
In the humanities, they need to be aware of this decline and agenda-driven, process. There are a couple of questions on the chat, and others are, I encourage others to put it up. This is from Christian Floberger. He's in Bangkok, our senior fellow as well. And if we speak of US decline, how can we then interpret its ability to invent a new geopolitical sphere in the Indo-Pacific, or to facilitate new forms of cooperation like Quad and AUKUS? A sign of weakness, looking for close allies to mask its increasing weakness? Or is that still an indication of US strength mobilizing other countries to support its semi-hegemonic position? Jeremy, would you want to come in?
Okay, yeah, I mean that's a great question. Well, it gets to Mohan's point that perhaps it's a bit overstated as far as the complete decline. I mean, the U.S. can still do this; they can still marshal cooperation with the AUKUS pact. On the other hand, I don't know. There's a lot of dissension I know in Australia about joining AUKUS. A lot, even countries that are traditionally allied with the United States are really more and more questioning whether their country should be involved with this kind of project. Because I know in discussion with some Australian, they're very worried that the United States is going to ensnare them through this pact into a war with China. And China is Australia's biggest trading partner, I believe. And there's really no interest of the Australians in picking a fight with China. So, I mean, there is a kind of disconnect. It seemed that the elites are going along with the United States, but the populations are very unhappy with those elites when they're doing this, and they would like to, forge a more independent policy. So, how much staying power does this have? These alliances could easily fracture, especially if the U.S. ramps it up. Say in a war with China, and Australians really have no desire to participate in that. And we could see revolts in these countries if the publics get more organized. We'll see revolts against those leaders who are just kowtowing to the U.S. interests. So that I think is a change from 30 years ago, where the public didn't really think twice about just allying with the United States, or say in the first Gulf War. I don't know how a lot of countries were willing to go along with the U.S. Involvement in the first Gulf War, but I think 30, 40 years later, the public is a lot more uneasy about those alliances. So it could crack at some point.
Yeah, Mohan, for example, the US has about 55 bases around, China, but who's the threat? Is China a threat to the world, or the US is a threat to China?
I think they will. You see, this is a different kind of Cold War now. In the old Cold War, the previous one, they were all clearly divided in the sense that, they were economically disengaged, technologically disengaged, socially disengaged. This is a completely different scenario with China and the US, are like Siamese twins, two querulous Siamese twins. The heads don't like each other, but the bodies all joined together. You've got this huge economic entanglement. Without the US, the Chinese economy will collapse. Without China's cheap goods, US consumer interests will not be met. US banks will not have those reserves to lend to their own people. Credit card debt in the US alone is 1 trillion. So that's the domestic debt. So domestic debt plays a role. With this Chinese money goes to fund individuals in their homes who go off to Walmart to buy. Walmart today is the third biggest exporter if it was a country. It would be the third biggest importer in the world. It imports Chinese goods and sustains China. So I think, this is a different way this game is going to play. And I don't think Chinese imperial attitudes are any different from those of America. Country elites act according to their self-interest. It's not national interest, but the self-interest of the elite. The Chinese elite is no different from the American elite or European elite or even an Indian elite, if there is one now. But we act according to our own interest. And the clash of the interests will determine historical outcomes. So let's see what happens now. I think this is a new game being played. It's not headlong crash. You're trying to insidiously pull the plug from under each other. And as long as the US cannot destabilize, like Trump tried it, but couldn't shut off the trade with China, it'll take a lot of time. And by the time new sources of production, Vietnam, Indonesia, or wherever, or even India comes up, it's going to take decades. I think we'll have to wait till 2050, 2060 to see historical changes coming about in the world order. And that change will come whether we are heading towards the world government, the structure of the United Nations, structure of the IMF, the World Bank, all have to change. Right now, the Chinese are as disinterested in reforming the UN as the Americans are. They're also quite happy being a part of the small hegemonic group on top who determine world order. Where is the African voice in the UN? Where is the Middle Eastern voice in the UN? 1.4 billion people in India are out of the loop. When does the United Nations get democratized? All these things will take a lot of time to happen. It's not going to happen in our lifetime. But the thinking has begun, the process. And we in India have to start thinking about it and talking about it. But we don't do it. And I think the debate needs to start in India first about restructuring the world order.
Yeah. Thank you, Mohan. There's another question from Captain Swarup. What could be the predominant shift in foreign policy if President Trump wins the next election?
That's for Jeremy or for me?
That's Jeremy first, and then Mohan.
Okay, well, that's a good question. Well, I think, from the rhetoric I've heard, including from Trump's son, they're really criticizing the war in Ukraine. And a lot of Republicans have been the ones trying to block the aid, the military aid, where the Democrats have been much more pro-war with regard to Ukraine. So I could see them de-escalating in Ukraine and pushing for a settlement, which may be inevitable, given that I don't know how much longer the Ukrainian army could actually sustain fighting if they have to kidnap people to send them into the army, and they've lost so many men. But I think we may see an escalation toward China. The Trump is more hawkish, certainly in his rhetoric when it comes, and more anti-China than Biden. So we may see a shift in focus toward Southeast Asia, a de-escalation somewhat in Ukraine, or possibly an end to that conflict with some kind of negotiated settlement that has worked out. But possible escalation with regard to China. The Middle East, yeah, I mean, Trump is very strongly pro-Israel and anti-Iran, so we could, he's the one who ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. So I think the threat of an expanded war in the Middle East with Trump, although, I mean, I don't think there is actually that great difference. I mean, Biden, the rhetoric may be somewhat different between the two, but Biden is really surrounded by neoconservatives. And his foreign policy has been very, very hawkish, and he's supported the huge military budgets. I mean, and Trump at times tries to present himself as more of an isolationist and America first, and he gets Americans, I think, naive, gullibly to support him. But I don't think he's by any means a pacifist. I mean, I think both parties are actually quite similar in foreign policy. So I don't, but I think the differences would be that Trump would focus more on Southeast Asia. He has at time criticized NATO, the NATO alliance, and that's one reason neoconservatives are horrified by the possibility of a Trump election. I think for the wrong reasons. I mean, I think there's good reason to be horrified by Trump, especially in his rhetoric toward immigrants and his racism and his penchant for authoritarianism and kind of want to be this Mussolini type figure. So I think that's very dangerous. But a lot of the liberals or neoconservatives fear Trump because he's not as strongly pro-NATO as Biden, which I'm not too keen on NATO myself. So, but so in sum, I don't think there would be that major change, except I think Ukraine you might see, because Biden has really been the most gung-ho, and the people around Biden have been really gung-ho about Ukraine. That's been like their project for years now. Whereas Trump has, even from a while back, did express skepticism. And now the rhetoric is pretty strong against that. So I could see him recalibrating a focus on Southeast Asia, as well as just beefing up the U.S. border. I mean, I don't know if he had, but some Republican have threatened to bomb Mexico. And there could be, I mean, he's definitely going to ramp up the border patrol and ramp up actions against immigrants. Would he reduce the military budget? I don't think so. During his presidency, even Ukraine, he made statements kind of skeptical of U.S. policy. He met with Putin, but he still expanded the U.S. military to Ukraine during his presidency, and he provided the sale of Javelin anti-tank missiles, which the Obama administration hadn't done yet. Biden had been championing that as the vice president under Obama. Sometimes in American politics, it's like a dog and pony show. There's certain rhetoric, but then when push comes to shove, they end up doing the same thing. But again, I would expect a shift, a focus more toward confronting China rather than Russia. And I don't think there'll be the isolationist rhetoric, I think, is just designed to win some votes. I think Trump is a nationalist and still an imperialist. So I think there'll be a lot of continuity.
Okay, so we are coming to the end of our session, but let me raise the last question and invite your final comments from both of you. One is the US has always projected itself as a beacon of democracy. And internally, yes, democracy is strong. But US has never supported democracy anywhere else in the world. And in the name of democracy and anti-communism, it's only intervened for its own interests. And last year was the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Salvador Allende in Chile. So the question is, has the US, used anti-communism? Now it's looking for a second Cold War for a reason against China. And has communism, the first stage, fallen prey to the US strategy? And probably China has now come up with a better solution, and it's showing to the world that it's governing better, probably it's getting richer. And therefore, in that context, the emerging world order, will it move towards a multipolar world dictated by the global south, which is recognized that colonialism never ended, and therefore they need to look at alternatives. And so will the new world order be dictated by the rise of BRICS, the institutions like NDB and other alternate financial institutions in place of World Bank and IMF? So what is the future for, what do you foresee for the future? I'll start with Mohan and then we'll wind up with Jeremy. Mohan?
Well, I'm not so sanguine about things changing. Like I said, elites will behave the way they have to behave, the way they're conditioned to behave, to dominate what they see, to become wealthier, to grab more power, to grab more wealth. It doesn't matter whether it's Chinese or American or English or Indian. It's how they maneuver in this complex world of change, which is going to be quite interesting. Right now, you're seeing a situation where, we're talking about AUKUS within Quad. Now, AUKUS is the equivalent of NATO, the extension of NATO here, which becomes an exclusively white man's club, an ex-European extension. So India is out of AUKUS. So India is a part of the talk shop. We'll have some few naval exercises here or there, but when it comes to real technology transfers, changes, it's not going to happen. As far as democracy is concerned, we're still not very clear about what democracy is now. Whether democracy just means frequent elections once in 4 years or 5 years, and ostensibly a free press. We know how free the press is in India. The media in India it's technically legally free, but it can be owned by a small group of people. It's the same in America. It's the same everywhere in the world. Interests own the media. They control information. Democracy is just having elections doesn't make you a democracy. And all people become equal, all people have a voice. Maybe someday we will have mobile phone voting where we keep putting on every issue and letting our opinions be known. Maybe we'll evolve something new. Already social media has such a huge influence on our thinking. And social media is completely circumventing big media. As a result, governments, even in India, are now trying to see what kind of legislation they can bring to rein in social media. So I think we are the process of change now. We'll have to see how this changes. Technology is changing on one side. People are changing. Now there's 700 million smartphones in the country. And people are seeing, people are expressing, people are talking to each other. How this will change us as a society, it'll take another 10, 15 years to know it.
Absolutely, yeah. Jeremy, your points? Recommends?
Okay, well, yeah, sure. I can make a few points. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I don't think the United States should be, it's not a model democracy, as Phil Oakes once saying, it's the best democracy money can buy. So, yeah, we're still fighting for real democracy, here in the United States, as people are fighting all over the world. But I would say also, yeah, I mean, there is a difference. I mean, I think the Western Empire in the United States has shown itself to be a particularly violent empire. So, I mean, even though I agree with Mohan that elites, in China will, look after themselves, and may do very bad things. But on the other hand, I mean, I think China is less militaristic. I mean, I think a power shift is welcome in the world because, China is not as militaristic a country. And I mean, look at China and Africa. I mean, yes, China has bad labor practices. I spent some time in Zambia, and there were major issues with Chinese-run mines and how they, the workers were really in bad conditions, and there were revolts when some miners died. On the other hand, China has invested a lot in the infrastructure in Africa, and they have done a lot of good. So I don't believe China is, benign like in Africa. But on the other hand, there is a lot of positive. But I mean, the United States has become so militaristic. Like even if you look at the U.S. and Africa, they're building these drone bases. Now they're trying to move them from Niger, where they had this coup, into Ghana and Ivory Coast. So I mean, I think the decline of U.S. power is welcome for humanity because the U.S. is just such a violent country, and I think with a more multipolar world order and with China in a stronger position, I mean that can serve as a check. Also, if China and Russia and this alliance develops, they can serve as a check on U.S. aggression. I mean, we saw this in Syria. The U.S. wasn't able to get its way in Syria. And that's, I mean, for the better. I mean, look, when the West just can operate unimpeded, look what they did in Libya. They just overthrew Gaddafi, and the whole society is in chaos and destroyed. Whereas Syria has a sovereign government still because they could rely on some Russian support. So if China and Russia, yeah, if this, I mean, I see it moving in that direction. I agree with Mohan. It may not happen today, but it's evolving in that direction. And I think we may see a much better world order and a better era of history with more parity in the future. So I think there are signs of optimism. And I think, I agree that elites always manipulate things in their favor. I think the Western empires rank as among the worst, and the United States is exceptionally violent, so it has to be contained.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeremy. And I fully agree with you. Like Mohan said, empires don't die overnight. The decline happens over decades. So the declining empire, once it's set in that decline, it's irreversible. And the US probably will end up by about 2050, 2070 time frame to accept that multipolarity is the only way. So you probably would either get a concert of Europe-style concert of global powers, or a different multipolar world order will emerge. And that's where China, India, and Russia will play probably critical roles. The behavior of the West, latching on to the directions of the US in handling the disaster, is a clear example that they are in an irreversible decline. With 23,000 civilians being killed and not, are trying to justify that process, is certainly has not gone down well at all with the global South. And the global South of today is in a different level as compared to what it was in the 70s and 80s and even 90s. And that is clearly visible in West Africa, where France literally ran a colonial empire for another 50 years. And now they're all rebelling, and the coups are demolishing the French control over there as well. So the world is clearly set, and this I call as a power transition moment. And we will probably see how things shape up over the next 20 years. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure having you with us, Jeremy and Mohan. And this was wonderful discussions. I enjoyed that thoroughly, absolutely. And we look forward to engaging you both more often in the future. Let me hand over to Adya to do the final honors. Adya?
Yes, sir. On behalf of the Peninsula Foundation, I take immense pleasure in proposing the vote of thanks. I would like to express my gratitude to Mr. Jeremy Kuzmarov and Mr. Mohan Guruswamy for joining us in this important discussion and sharing their expertise with us. It was very enlightening and thought-provoking in a way, giving the real picture of the current geopolitical situation and what the future would look like. I'd like to thank Air Marshal M. Matheshwaran for having taken up this topic and bringing together this eminent panel, taking this discussion forward and sharing his views on the subject. Last but not least, I'd like to thank our lovely audience who have joined us today. Looking forward to seeing you all at the Peninsula Foundation's future events. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Adya. Thank you, Jeremy.
Nice meeting you, Jeremy.
Yes,
Thank
nice
you.
to meet you. Thanks.
Yeah, we'll be in touch.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you, Matsi. Thank you. Excellent program.
Thank you.
Excellent webinar. Really.
See you
Enjoyed
again.
it thoroughly. Mohan, Jeremy, hats off to you guys. You spoke so frankly and with such insightful appreciation of the subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Bob.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye, Matish.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sirs. Thank you.